I would like just shortly to introduce both panelists before saying some words about what we're going to be talking about. I would very happy to have on the panel James Kurth, Professor of Political Science and Senior Research Scholar at Swarthmore College, and Eisuke Sakakibara, who is now Professor of International Finance at the University of Aoyama Gakuin, and formerly been Vice Minister of Finance in Japan at the time of the Japanese financial crisis at the end of the 90s. And what we would like to discuss is about the core and the international relations. I would like to introduce, because I'm a little bit the part, the European part, just sharing, but bringing in a smart European vision. Perhaps by introducing, on a personal note, I remember when I was raised in economic and political terms in Western Germany in the 1970s, 80s. The US have always been for us those who have saved us, who were the big ones and the strong ones, and those who protected us and our friends. And at the same time, which created many critiques about they brought us about Reaganomics and some international trouble at some point. But I mean, the whole view was quite, these are the ones we should look up. And at the same time, Japan was seen in Germany very much as, and in other countries I suppose too, as the Japan seemed to have this industrial strategy and very forceful in getting the new big power, international power and economic power, and there was a lot of fear about this danger that we will be eaten up by Japanese big companies and industrial policy and some Japanese sort of planification or whatever with a big ministry and so on. In fact, in the end, I mean, now we were a little bit disturbed by the fact that the US is not really the big one we would like to look up again still. And we were not eaten up by the Japanese. So the question is, on the one side, is what is happening in the US something which is just an intermediate trouble, or is it some part of a longer decline? And what can we learn from what the Japanese have experienced in that time? And what can both bring together, and what does that mean for the international order and the global order we are facing or emerging, which is emerging? So I would like to first ask James Kurth to give us his points on what has been this development of the US and what could we learn out of this in international relationships.
Well, thank you very much, Thomas. In the course of my presentation, and indeed in the course of my very long paper, which is on the INET website, I actually address the very points that you've just been raising and point out that, in fact, the United States and Western Europe, and especially in the then West Germany, was indeed the great protector for so many decades. And I argue in my paper that that era has coming to an end and could well come crashing down. Second, I also agree that West Europeans in general, and especially West Germans, did look up to the United States to provide a kind of economic model and even a cultural model, including Reaganomics. And in my paper, I spend quite a bit of time on the reforms of the Reagan administration and how they succeeded in resolving what I call the first global crisis of the American empire, but at a cost of laying the seeds for the causes that we now see bringing about what I call the second crisis of the general crisis of the American empire. So the very two aspects that West Germans looked up to, the first, the United States as a protector, and the second as a model, including perhaps the economic liberalism model, those two are interrelated, and that the second has hollowed out the conditions for the first. But now let me turn more generally to link the topic of my paper with the topic of this conference, and in particular the topic of this panel. Now, the topic of the panel is core fractures in international relations. And one of the central ordering concepts of the conference, of course, has been fractures in the form of dual economies within the most developed countries. That's been the central focus. And the conception of the core here at the conference is that the core are the most developed economies, such as the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and perhaps slightly more broadly, the northern core of the EU, that is to say, counting Austria and the Netherlands as well as Germany, and also Japan. There's a question, well, what about the other countries in the EU? Are they core, or are they rapidly becoming periphery? And then that reminds us that in an earlier generation or two, there was a very robust literature about cores and fractures and peripheries. And that was the literature developed initially by Latin Americans. They would have good reasons to know what it means to be a periphery of the United States core. And that was dependency theory. And there was a later, a related version called world systems theory. Now, in that conception, the core was, like in our current INET conception, the most developed economies. But the fractures or divisions were not within the core economies. That was inconceivable in those days. We're talking about the 70s and the 80s. The fractures were between the core and the peripheral economies, between the so-called developed and underdeveloped economies. But, in a way, the guiding spirit of this conference, W. Arthur Lewis, long ago pointed to fractures within the developing economies, the dual economy, beautifully etched out in the presentation earlier in this conference by Peter Timon, who updated and transported the conception of dual economies from the developing economies of the past to the developed economies of the present. Now, under the Lewis conception, there were fractures, therefore, within the underdeveloped economies between capitalist and labor, corresponding somewhat between industrial labor, industrial capital, and agricultural labor, and then the transition from agricultural to, of course, urban labor, and between urban and rural. But in the conception of the dependency theorist, the capitalist in the underdeveloped countries had close integrated relations with the capitalist in the core countries. They were a kind of dependent bourgeoisie in the language of dependency theory. They were a comprador capitalist in the words of Mao Zedong. And so we can sort of see, if we update that conception, that many of the capitalists in the smaller advanced economies are, if you will, dependent bourgeoisie. They are, in a way, dependent upon the leading global capitalist in the core economies today. So I just wanted to sort of link up these two eras of core periphery conceptions, an earlier one and a later one. The later one that we've been addressing in the conference doesn't focus so much on international relations. The earlier one did, and the purpose of my paper and discussion is to focus on that. Now, there were, historically, according to the world systems analysis, 3 historical cores in the modern era beginning some 500 years ago. The first of these cores was the Netherlands, or the United Provinces more broadly. They really led the commercial revolution. The second one was Britain, or the United Kingdom. They led the Industrial Revolution. And the third has been America, or the United States. And that, of course, perfected the Industrial Revolution in the mid-20th century, and then has led the financial revolution. Therefore, the United States, and earlier Britain, and earlier the Netherlands, is the core of the core. The core of the core. And therefore, my paper is on the fractures today and how they came about in the core of the core. Now, my paper itself, don't worry, my presentation will not, focuses on the history or the life cycle of the United States as the core of the core of the international system, more broadly defined, the world system, currently and most accurately defined now as the global system. This life cycle began in what the Germans used to call Year Zero, 1945, the end of the Second World War, and the transition to 1947, the beginning of the Cold War. And dating this American core of the core from 1947 to 2017 is roughly 70 years later. And I argue that what began 70 years ago is now coming to an end very quickly and very broadly before our very eyes. So I cover a period of some 70 years of different phases in my paper, but roughly the first half of that era, from 1945 or 47 to roughly 1980, 81, was a period where at the core, at the United States, and in its most, shall we say, mirror image allies, like in Western Europe, there wasn't any talk about a dual economy in the core. All the talk was about the dual economy between the core and the periphery. But since 1980 or 81 and the beginning of Reaganomics, and certainly since 1990 and 91, the collapse of the Soviet Union, which had been in the business of containing the United States, even though the United States thought itself in the business of containing the Soviet Union, once the Soviet Union was no longer there to contain the United States and its conception of a liberal international economy then ran amok. And we have an international global economy, and that economy was the perfection of Reaganomics as carried to a wider world. And during that half part of the 70-year life cycle, from 1980 or 81, beginning of Reaganomics, 1990 or 91, the actual full spreading of it, that has been the era of the development of the dual economy within the core economies, and especially within the core of the core. Now, I refer to this American system as an American empire, but it is not an empire quite like other empires. Rather, it has some similarities with the earlier European empires, or for that matter, the earlier Japanese empire, but there are some important differences. The American way of empire was not so much a colonial empire, a direct rule. It was what is often called a hegemonic empire, an indirect rule, in which the security zone is a sphere of influence, or sphere of interest, an economic zone, or protectorates militarily, but not direct colonies. And that is the American way of empire. And it has some analogies for those of you who are British with the British Empire in India, in which there was the British India proper, that was colonial, direct rule. And then there were the Indian princely states, often ceremonial, symbolic, but nonetheless, technically, some kind of autonomy or independence. And that has some analogies with the United States relationship in Latin America. Now, in this American empire, there are three great hegemonic systems that were born in the golden years of 1947, 48, 49. And these three great alliance systems are hegemonic, they're called alliance systems, hegemonic systems are Latin America, and I refer to, in the paper, to the United States and Latin America as a prototypical American hegemonic system. It was already begun decades before, but it was perfected in 1947 on the onset of the Cold War. But then there is the West European archetypical hegemonic system. And then there's also the East Asian or Western Pacific hegemonic system, which is a hub and spokes system. That is to say, no great international organization putting them together like in Latin America or in Europe, but a series of bilateral treaties for the most part. Now, let me just briefly mention the characteristics of this archetypical U.S. hegemonic system, the one in Western Europe. Its economic base was, its inauguration was the famous Marshall Plan of 1947. But also at the core of this plan was the idea that European countries would have to cooperate. They'd have to begin to devolve a little bit of their national autonomy to be able to get the Marshall Plan and the Organization of European Economic Recovery. At the military dimension was, of course, in Nato in 1949. The political dimension was the idea that European countries would become like American country, like the United States, liberal democracies. But the elites of America at that time were willing to make two compromises to be able to bring the European nations of that time on board this new plan for American hegemony and American alliance in Europe. One compromise was with the Social Democrats and the Socialists of the time. Social Democrats and Socialists could be invited into the liberal democratic system on condition they join in excluding the communists from the governments of West European countries. And that project was completed as of 1948. So that was a compromise that, for the most part, free market Americans were wisely willing to make to get the European countries on board, to split the left between the Social Democrats and Socialists on the one hand and the Communists on the other. They also made a compromise with the conservative parties of the day, who in those days were much more far nationalist in orientation. And they could continue to have their national symbols, even their national armies, national histories, but the basic idea, in the fullness of time, these would begin to devolve to more and more European cooperation, and therefore, ultimately, the project on the economic side and more broadly would issue in the U.S. support for the EEC and then the later European organizations. And so this very fully developed multidimensional hegemonic system in Western Europe operated extremely well for many, many decades. Occasional crises, President de Gaulle in France, but compared to other crises going on, relatively modest. And then, of course, there was this institutionalized in the great military organization NATO and the successive great economic organizations. Now, in the paper, I go through the founding era of this American empire, which is beautifully exemplified in the West European case. And then I talk about the first general crisis of the American empire, roughly from 1961 to 1980. There were challenges in each of the three hegemonic systems, but the real challenge came within the United States. That challenge on the economic level was the great stagflation. On the military level, it was the Vietnam War and the later Vietnam Syndrome, a reluctance to intervene, not so much such a good thing from the point of view of imperial power. The political challenge was Watergate. Each of these challenges consumed the United States political discourse and divisions in the 1970s. They would not be brought to an end until what I call the Reagan resolution of the first general crisis. The economic resolution consisted of three parts. The first part, and these are the beginning of Reaganomics, the first part was to turn essentially economic decision-making over to the Federal Reserve, and especially the then chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, Volcker, Paul Volcker, at the time, who radically increased interest rates and broke the back of the inflation part of stagflation. The second part was supply-side economics, a new name for an old Republican phenomenon of deregulation, of low taxes. That was supposed to get economic growth going, and it did. So it broke the stagnation part of stagflation. It was reinforced by a massive increase in military spending that, of course, could also get the economy going again. That led to the military solution to the Vietnam War and the Vietnam Syndrome. That was to develop a very high-tech information age, even before it was known to be the information age, military weapons, precision-guided munitions, that sort of thing. Then the political solution was that a big payoff to big business and to some extent small business with the deregulation and the lower taxes. As far as the popular base for Reagan, the so-called Reagan Democrats, the disaffected American working class, they were given lots of rhetoric, religious rhetoric, patriotic rhetoric, but no real policy. Rather, the policies of the free market began a systematic hollowing out of the industrial heartland of the United States, and therefore the Rust Belt commenced at that point, and what we would then see in mass production of the left behind working class in America and the European world began at that. Least all the energies of a revived American capitalism empowered by Reaganomics to then advance from the free world level, half the world, to a whole world, a global level. And America became the sole superpower. It created a new world order. Economically, that was characterized by globalization, financialization, and information age technology. These three dramatic changes, growing on earlier ones, but now truly qualitative changes, came together to have the new United States in its new global order conducting a global economic revolution. Militarily, there was a development with high-tech weapons, the so-called revolution in military affairs. With the high technology of the United States, we would be able to roll over any possible competing power, rogue state, even peer powers, if they dared to think they were peer. Where it wasn't a post-industrial military, but a pre-industrial insurgency that would bring America to a kind of grinding, grueling war. The political formula of the new global scope was liberal democracy, especially for the advanced countries. No more concessions to the social or social democratic tendencies of an earlier day. Socialist parties would have to become neoliberals. No more concessions to those little remnants of nationality. No, they'd have to get fully integrated into the European Union. And then for the less developed countries, regime change. America's formula would be the formula that would be reproduced, not just so dramatically as in Eastern Europe, just before the great unleashing of the American empire at the global scale, but this would be reproduced in many other places, best of all, it was thought, in the Middle East. Of course, the working out of these three tendencies out of that has now led to the second general crisis of the American empire from 2008 to date. This has had a military crisis, beginning with the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, which instead of being high-tech, short, quick, easy wars, have been long, grueling insurgencies, each one longer than any American war in American history. But much more informable is the military crisis being provoked by two great revisionist powers who resent and resist this global liberal order, and that's revisionist Russia and revisionist China. The United States kept pressing on the Russian Federation, pressing militarily, getting closer and closer to what had been the borders of the Soviet Union, and finally within the Soviet Union, with the admission of the Baltic countries to NATO. And they continued to press. In 2008, they said they wanted Georgia and Ukraine to join NATO. And the Russians no longer were supine and were rolling over as they'd been in the 1990s and early 2000s. They resented and they resisted. And immediately the Putin regime in Russia responded in Georgia by the Georgian War and developed a new method of breaking apart any country that the United States, or more broadly the United States and Europe, are trying to bring into their system by breaking it into little bits and pieces. That is to say, statelets such as South Ossetia and Abkhazia. In Ukraine, this would be repeated with 2 little states in eastern Ukraine. In other words, make a bordering country that had been a target of the United States and of the Europeans, Western Europeans, so unattractive they wouldn't be able to incorporate it into their system. And in addition, they developed hybrid warfare to sort of short-circuit the high-tech advantage of the United States. This could be seen as relatively far in the periphery of Western Europe, if it were Georgia and Ukraine. But it's not so far away when these methods are now being turned towards the Baltic countries. That is what is the hinge of fate of the NATO alliance system and of the European Union in the near future. If the Russians are provoked into activating their techniques of amputee of statelets and hybrid warfare in the Baltic countries, that will reveal NATO to be essentially a hollow alliance, or what the Chinese would call a paper tiger. And then that brings us now to revisionist China, which is also coming back in a big way. The President Xi Jinping, who will shortly be confirmed to have even more power in China than he's had in the preceding 5 years or more, Xi Jinping is presiding over what he considers the 100 years of redemption that followed the 100 years of humiliation of Chinese history. And that is the China Dream. And the China Dream includes extending China's hegemony over the 3 China Seas, the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, and the South China Sea. And they are daily pressing against the American alliance system in East Asia as they have the U.S. has extended its commitments over those seas. And so you now have the Chinese as an irresistible force moving towards those seas to push them out of the area covered by the American alliance system in East Asia. But the American elites consider that alliance system that has existed for 70 years to be absolutely necessary to the continuation of their understanding of world order, and they are an immovable object. So at the moment you have an irresistible Chinese force moving quickly to collide with an unmovable American object, and the time is shortly, probably not too far away. There will be a great naval collision, and it will be bad for all. Well, I won't take the time to go into yet another threat of the East Asian system, and that is the advent of a North Korean nuclear weapons capability, especially what is shortly going to be developed, and that is a invulnerable or so-called second strike nuclear capability capable of hitting the United States with ICBMs, or International Continental Ballistic Missiles. And that, of course, will hollow out the fundamental base of the U.S. military guarantee of Japan and of South Korea, both of whom have forsworn any nuclear weapons in the past, both of whom have robust potential to create their own nuclear force. And although the North Korean nuclear weapon system may not result in a nuclear war between the United States and North Korea, it is very likely to issue in 2 nuclear powers in Northeast Asia, and that will be the Japanese and the South Koreans. So the American alliance system in East Asia, I think, is doomed. The American alliance system in Western Europe is hanging by a thread, a Damocles sword held by the Russians. I won't go in, I don't have time to go in the economic crisis and the response of the American elites to it, which have been purely self-interested from the point of elites, as if the 70%, the lower 70%, did not exist. And I won't go into the political crisis, the government dysfunction, and the response of the U.S. Leads to that. But ever since 2008, the American political crisis has deepened, and the divisions have broadened, the dysfunctions have become more and more pronounced. And so by 2016, it could be said that all of that ideology about the universal applicability of the American liberal democratic model, by that time, it had appeared to be, the American political ideology appeared to be almost hypocritical, nonsensical, and delusional. And then came 2016. And the elections that have been discussed so much at this conference and have terrified so many Europeans as well as so many Americans. And we now have the Trump administration being besieged not only by a Democratic Party resistance, that is, the resistance of the Democratic Party establishment, but even by a Republican Party establishment located in the Congress. And so the American fractures and within America have now migrated to a great fracture between the White House and the Capitol down Pennsylvania Avenue. So I'll just conclude with the concluding paragraph in my paper. Thus, the U.S. political system in 2017 has been characterized by multiple fractures. Fractures between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Fractures within the Republican Party between the Republican Congress and the Republican administration. Fractures within the Republican Congress between the establishment leadership and the majority and an anti-establishment minority. And even fractures within the Republican administration, the Trump administration, between officials who represent this establishment or elites, these are the national security officials, who are a majority of the officials, and those who represent Trump's electoral base and Trump himself, who are a minority. And so the political events of the United States during 2016 and 2017 have now reached the point that much of the world not only sees the U.S. political ideology to be hypocritical, nonsensical, and delusional, but they now see the U.S. political system itself to be fatuous, preposterous, and dangerous.
Thank you, James Kurth. I hand over to Mr. Sakakibara to explain what has become out of this danger that once was perceived from an economic point of view from Japan. Okay.
Well, while the previous speaker focused on political system, which has evolved in the current current world, I would focus on the economics of various countries at this moment. I think what previous speaker called the demise of the American empire is somewhat relative. I would say it would be the rise of other industrial countries. Firstly, by countries like Germany and Japan, who lost the Second World War, has come back to be the industrial giants. And recently, Asian countries like China and India has gained lots of power, at least the economic power. So this the whole phenomenon has been called the Lee Orient phenomenon. The center of the world economy has come back to the Orient, to Asia, particularly to China and India. And if you look back, 2,000 years of the world history, well, China and India, most of the time, has been the center, economic center of the world until the 19th century. So what we are experiencing right now is not something unusual. If you look back the history, it's going back to the state of affairs before the 19th century. But this Lee Orient phenomenon is taking place quite rapidly. That means, on the other hand, what the previous speaker called the demise of the American empire in the world, particularly in Asia. Well, what I would like to address today is the Japanese perspective on globalization and following the manufacturing industry in developing countries. As globalization proceeded rapidly, manufacturing industry in most of the developed countries declined quite steadily. Although the Japanese share of the manufacturing industry declined from 27.1% of nominal GDP in 1980 to 18.2% in 2012, it is substantially higher than the world average of 20.2%. Share of the manufacturing sector in the United States is only 10.7%, while it is 10.1% in UK and 10.0% in France. Developed countries which had higher ratio of manufacturing industry were Germany, 22.4%, Switzerland, 19.0%, and Japan, 18.2%. Japan and Germany still are major manufacturing hub, where the ratio of overseas production increased quite, however, ratio of overseas production increased quite rapidly during the last several decades. In 1995, ratio of foreign sort of production was only 8.3% for Japan, but increased to 24.3% in 2014. During the last 30 years, the ratio tripled. In particular, overseas production of transport machinery was as high as 46.9%. In 2015, the ratio of overseas sales of the Japanese corporation reached 53.3% of the total. In the same year, overseas sales ratio of North and South America was the highest at 25.9%, followed by Asia Pacific, 18.4%, and Europe, 8.9%. In particular, transportation machinery and electric machinery ratio were as high as 62.5% and 55.5%. This is definitely the result of the globalization of the Japanese, and Japanese corporation has adjusted to the ongoing trend. Rather than exporting from Japan, producing at the sites of at the sales location is much more efficient and less costly. Also, while Japanese domestic demand is slowing down, demand in developing countries like China, India, and ASEAN countries are growing stronger. Growth rate of GDP of India and China in 2016 were 6.83% and 6.70% respectively. ASEAN countries grew at high rate as well. Philippines grew at 6.84%, while Myanmar and Vietnam grew at 6.3% and 6.21% in 2016. Indonesian growth was 5.02%, while Malaysia grew at 4.24%. Japanese companies try to benefit from these high growth countries manufacturing and selling at their countries. Although Japanese domestic growth has been very low at around 1%, companies could enjoy high growth by globalizing their operations. The companies whose overseas sales are high are Mitsui Kaiyo, producer of equipment for ocean oil field. 100% of their operation were in foreign countries. Murata Manufacturing, TDK, Shinano, and Yamaha Motors and Takeda also had more than 80% of their operation in foreign countries. Top Japanese corporations like Toyota, Canon, Sony, and Nissan also have high ratio of overseas sales. In 2015, Toyota's overseas sales was 75% of the total, while Canon, Sony, and Nissan had 81%, 72%, and 80% respectively. Many of the automotive and precision machinery companies are global companies. Accordingly, overseas production ratio was as high as 24.3% in 2014, as mentioned above. And the ratio of manufacturing corporations engaged in overseas production was 64.6% in 2014. Overseas production ratio of automobile is particularly high. In 2015, overseas production ratio of all Japanese automobile producers was as high as 67% of the total. The ratio was 38% of the total in year 2000. And during the past 15 years, the ratio increased by 76%. In 2015, Toyota's ratio, overseas production ratio, was 64.3%, while those of Honda, Nissan, and Mazda were 83.9%, 83.15%, and 36.9% respectively. These Japanese automobile companies are truly global companies. In 2016, Toyota Group sales was #1 in the world, totaling 10.151 million cars, followed by Volkswagen of 9.93 million, and General Motors of 9.884 million. Fourth was Renault-Nissan Alliance with 8.528 million. Honda was a #7 with 4.710 million, and Suzuki was a #10 with 2.88 million. Volkswagen is a major competitor of Toyota, and it has many famous brands under its control. Porsche, Audi, Bentley, and Lamborghini are in Volkswagen Group. During the first 6 months of 2017, the alliance of Nissan, Renault, and Mitsubishi became the top in the world with the sales of 5.3 million, beating 5.2 million sales of Volkswagen. Toyota Group was a third with sales of 5.2 million. But those three are sort of around the same numbers. Given President Donald Trump's criticism that the production of automobiles in Mexico and subsequent export from there decreases U.S. employment, Toyota announced a 5-year plan that it would increase investment in the U.S. by $10 billion during this period. Domestic production of automobiles in Japan reached 9.2 million in 2016 and formed a solid basis for the Japanese economy. If the further investment in the United States, as committed to President Trump, result in the reduction of the domestic production, it would have serious negative impacts on the Japanese economy. The companies have to come up with the plan to increase U.S. production, but not to decrease the Japanese domestic production, which may not be that easy. As mentioned above, Toyota is a global company, and U.S. is a very important market for them. During the first quarter of 2017, Toyota's sales in the North America was 2.85 million, which is bigger than the Japanese sales in Japan of 2.24 million. Its sales in Europe was 920,000, while it was 1.41 million in Asia, excluding China. In Central and South America, it was 1.48 million. Given the extreme importance of the U.S. market for Toyota, it is only natural and appropriate that Toyota responded to President Trump's criticism immediately by announcing its 5-year plan to increase U.S. production. In the 1980s, Japanese manufacturing industry was the biggest domestic industry, occupying close to 30% of the total, while service industry was less than 15%. However, the share of manufacturing industries has declined steadily to around 18% in 2015. In the meantime, service industry, which was around 13% in 1950, increased its share to around 20% in 2015. Currently, service industry and sales industry together have close to 35% of the total, which is almost double the share of manufacturing industry. The expansion of service and sales industry is a worldwide trend for developed economies. In the United States, the share of the tertiary sector in 2015 was close to 80%. It was 79% in UK. France and Germany and Italy also had the share of more than 70%. Japanese share was 71%, which was somewhat low compared to United States and the UK. But it roughly corresponds to the German share. As mentioned earlier, Japan and Germany still maintain a solid manufacturing sector despite worldwide trend toward tertiary sector. Value-added percentage of service sector out of total GDP was 69.4% in 1997 among OECD members, and it increased to 74.2% in 2015. And as mentioned above, US and UK, France service sector share were above the OECD level, while German and Japanese shares were below that average. Between 1997 to 2015, German share increase was relatively small compared to others, only 1.5 percentage point. Although Japanese share increased more than 5 percentage points during the period, it was still 71% in 2015. With regards to the Japanese employment, tertiary industry employs 70% of the labor force, total labor force, against 24% of the secondary industry and 3.4% in primary industry in 2015. The ratio was quite different from 1950, where 40% was in the primary industry and 25% was in the secondary industry. Japanese economy is now dominated by tertiary industry, both in production and employment. However, compared to the United States and some European countries, Japanese ratio is somewhat lower than U.S. ratio. U.S. ratio of tertiary industry employment is to total labor force is 80.0%, while UK, France, and Italy and Germany had around 70% respectively. Relatively low share in tertiary industry sector for Japan and Germany is a result of the fact that Japan and Germany still maintains fairly solid manufacturing sector. Share of the manufacturing sector in Japan is about 20%. In Germany, it's a little bit more than 20%. Both Japan and Germany have strong automobile productions, and the sales in 2015, Toyota was #1 in the new car sales, which was followed by the Volkswagen very closely. Since the technological development in automobiles and machinery area proceed quite rapidly, developed countries still maintain high share in production and sales. In 2014, the world production of automobiles amounted to 91.31 million vehicles. Out of that, 24 million was produced in China, 12 million in the United States, 10 million in Japan, and 6 million in Germany, and 4 million in Korea. Apart from China, all other producers are developed countries. Toyota and Volkswagen compete to become the number one. And in 2015, Toyota sales was 10 million, while Volkswagen sales was 9.9 million. Although Japanese car sales amounted altogether, Japanese car sales amounted to 32.4% of the total, while German car sales amounted to 16%. General Motors and Ford had 18% of the total world share. All the world share of the tertiary industry has steadily increased to 70 and 80% in developed countries. Manufacturing sector has not necessarily weakened, particularly in Japan and Germany. Indeed, employment in tertiary sector has steadily increased, and in recent and it reached 70% from 2012 in Japan. In the United States, ratio is still higher, amounting to 80% of the total. UK also had around 80%. But Germany and Italy, along with Japan, has 70%, which is much lower than the US and UK. As mentioned earlier, Germany and Italy still have quite solid manufacturing sector employment, around 20% of the labor force. So although the expansion of the service sector is a worldwide trend, hollowing of the manufacturing sector has not taken place in countries like Japan and Germany. They have solid manufacturing sector and remain to be the production hub for high technology area, including automotive industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Just to follow up on what you said, James Kurth, as someone who has been raised in the thought that you will protect us, I'm a little scared about what you said. I mean, is there any hope? I mean, or what will be going on in the US? You described it until now. Is there any lesson from history that can be taken out to anticipate?
I take lessons from history, and they all lead to no hope. However, that's not the conclusion you want. On occasion, hope does spring out of disaster. Many good things happened in Germany after year zero. But they did happen after the German catastrophe.
But as I emphasized, I mean, the decline of the U.S. is relative. It's it's a rise of the countries like Japan, Germany, China, and India.
I quite agree.
Yeah.
That's on the, dare I say, the Pacific front. But on the European front, the threat to the American empire doesn't come from Germany, except in the complicated way that the southern periphery of Europe considers that a threat from Germany. But in that sense, there is not an economic threat from Russia, but there is definitely a military threat and a political threat in the sense of intimidation of the European countries. So is there hope for that? Well, yes and no. I often say that I always have two answers to every question. The first answer is yes and no. The second is no and yes. And in this particular case, it's yes and no. Yes, there's hope. At the time that the Soviet Union collapsed and the Warsaw Pact collapsed, there was an understanding, never written down, that was unusual for the Russians, and they've regretted it ever since, between the administration of George H.W. Bush on the one hand and the new Yeltsin regime, or at least the declining Gorbachev regime, in what was the Soviet Union and became the Russian Federation. And that is that NATO would not expand to the east. At most, it might allow West German forces, now unified German forces, to occupy what was Eastern Germany, but there would be no expansion of NATO, either in membership to the former Warsaw Pact countries, and certainly no expansion of putting NATO troops in those countries. Now, step by step, the Clinton administration and then the George W. Bush administration violated that understanding. And in the doing so, they brought first NATO and then NATO forces. And then the European Union, of course, came along. And in the Russian mentality, they see the European Union and NATO as two sides of the same American-led coin. Now, that can be an inaccurate view, but that's their view. There's the economic dimension, the military dimension, that is the European Union dimension and the NATO dimension. And as that two-sided coin rolled closer and closer to what had been the former borders of the Soviet Union, and then rolled over those borders by admitting the Baltic countries to each of the two organizations, the Russians began to develop a great fear that they've had for hundreds of years of some power coming closer and closer to them and removing what every Russian regime, the Tsars, the Soviets, and now the Putin regime, every Russian regime has always insisted upon that on their western border there be a sphere of influence, a belt of buffer states that would have friendly governments. The most kindly, gentle version of this throughout the Cold War and even today is Finland, in which Finland was never in part of the Western security zone, but was seen as part of the Russian security zone. So militarily, it was part of a Russian sphere of influence, or of at least security. Economically, Finland could become part of the West. That actually served part of the Soviet interest. It could be part of the Russian interest today. Politically, Finland was more or less liberal, actually social democracy, but there were constraints. The press had to moderate its criticism of the Soviets. The president of Finland could never be from the Socialist Party, because that was seen as a very pro-Western competitor to the Communist Party. Always had to be head of the Agrarian Party. But Finland was a country that sort of satisfied the Russian conception of a country on their frontier that was part of their buffer zone, had a friendly government. It didn't have to be like Poland or Czechoslovakia. Well, the United States, since the Clinton administration, has not accepted that. They believe they have a right to extend their alliance system right up to the frontiers, not just of what had been the Soviet Union, but of Russia itself. And the Russians will not permit that. And the closer and closer that the United States got, the more and more they reacted. And so I believe there will be no solution until the United States recognizes that Ukraine and Georgia, and to take the two hotspots, are part of a Russian sphere of influence, a safety zone. And I believe, I argue this in the paper, a great compromise could have been made for a Baltic exception. I won't go into the details here. And that the Russians only began to impinge upon the Baltics after the United States first impinged upon Georgia, and especially after Ukraine. Because the Russians have always followed a forever under a regime, a tit-for-tat strategy. If the West, the leading Western power of the day, whatever it was, the Poles, the Swedes, the French, the Germans, now the Americans, if they impinge upon the Russian security zone, then the Russians will react tit for tat, or up, or more than that, impinge upon the Western security zone. And that's what I believe they have in mind with the Baltics. So I believe there could be a grand division of understanding about the security zone. It would still preserve the Baltics being part of NATO and the European Union. But let us remember, throughout the entire Cold War, there were never NATO forces stationed in Norway and Denmark. That was part of the understanding. Now, so that's the hope. But why there's no hope is the American elite will not accept this. This is utterly unacceptable. Despite the fact that this was the advice of Henry Kissinger, recently, they're not going to accept that. Kissinger is too old school, too 19th century. But the arc of history tends towards rules and norms. And so you have, once again, on the European front, an irresistible force, the Russians, and an immovable object, the American elite.
Okay, so no hope. Mr. Sakakibara, to get to the Japanese, in conferences like this, when economists discuss, especially in the last few years, about the America and American fate and American problems, and there's talk about secular stagnation, the worst that they quote as a historic example is Japan. As the country who has had this crisis and badly managed, and at part at least, and then had two lost decades. And listening to you, it seems as if you're quite happy with that.
Well, this discussion of lost 2 decades or lost decade, I think, is as a mistake. Whenever that talk was quite active among the Americans, I used to tell them, come to Japan, come to Tokyo, or visit Kyoto or anywhere else in Japan. You'd never see any disasters there. Exactly. You never see anything which, is like, 2 decades of lost sort of economy. And it is true that Japan had the high growth period between 1956 and 73. Average annual rate of growth was 9.1%. Between 74 and 1990, we have the stable growth period. Average growth rate at that time was 4.2%. But since 1990 to now, average rate of growth is 1.0%. And some people say that decline in the growth rate is the indication that of the lost 2 decades. But I don't think so. It is an indication of the maturity of the Japanese economy. In 1987, per capita GDP of Japan had exceeded that of the per capita GDP of the United States, and it continued until year 2000. Of course, it is closely related to the exchange rate. Between in the 80s and 90s, yen rate was quite high. So it reversed in 2001. But it is true that in late 1980s and 90s, Japanese living standard, Japanese per capita GDP has reached the level of the United States and major European countries. So Japan has matured, since 1990, and the growth rate has come down to 1%. For mature economy like Japan, having the growth rate is 1% is only natural. Many European countries do. United States is somewhat different. United States has some elements of developing countries all the time, so that you could grow at 2%, 2.5%. But most of the mature European countries and Japan are now growing at 1%, which is quite satisfactory as far as I'm concerned. And Japan may be at the peak, and people say there's no better tomorrow than today. But now people are enjoying, the high living standard, And another thing about Japan is that income distribution and wealth distribution is somewhat egalitarian. It's much more equal than the income and wealth distribution in the United States. So I would say average Japanese is probably more affluent than average American.
Mm. Yeah. But just one question on this. There's been a lot of talk the last few days about debt. Japan paid a high price in terms of public debt, didn't it?
Public debt, yeah. Public debt is very high. It is 240% of the GDP. And it will probably, within the matter of next 10 years, it will grow to 300%. However, accumulated household savings of Japan is around 300%, so that all the government debts are covered by Japanese. So Japanese current account has been in surplus. So Japan as a whole, if you combine the government sector and household sector and corporate sector, have been in the black, have been in surplus. So that I am not that much worried about the government debts. It is being paid by the Japanese people We have not borrowed from the United States, or we haven't borrowed from any other countries. We finance our government, and of course, and we know how to solve this problem of the government deficits, increase taxes, and increasing of consumption tax, value-added tax is in the agenda of Mr. Abe. And I think consumption tax or value-added tax should be increased from current 8% to 10% and eventually to 15 to 20%, like most of the European countries.
Mr. Kurth, before opening and seeing if there are any questions, you talked about the U.S. as the core of the core, so there was another core and others not at the core of the core. Is there any chance that they help out and get some new core which is not so centered on the US? I'm talking especially on sort of Europe or something else, Mr. Kurth.
So are you asking, will somehow the European part of the American empire, i.e. the U.S. alliance system in Europe, are the European members, are they going to have a vote? Did I hear you say that?
No, reason for hope, or for something stepping in to help America or to bring this core to something which is less concentrated on the U.S. but still getting more power again.
Well, I guess I would have you ask the European leaders if they're willing to lead in that direction, including your own Chancellor, Angela Merkel. Now, it seems to me she's wholly bought into the liberal global order paradigm. That is to say, an open global economy, a robust U.S. Or a European alliance system, a robust European Union directed from Brussels, and of course indirectly from Frankfurt, and a liberal democracy. She's wholly bought into that, and she's wholly bought into as a universal rules and norms. You might say she's America's ambassador in Berlin.
Well, in my view, not only the United States, but Western countries, including the United States and the major European countries, those Western countries dominating the world economy is about to be over. Now, Chinese GDP is number 2, and probably within the next 10 years, Chinese GDP would exceed that of the United States. And according to the forecast of PricewaterhouseCoopers, in 2050, China would be number 1 in GDP, and number 2 would be India, exceeding the GDP of the United States. So that, from 2016 to 2050, the highest growing sort of countries of the world would be Asian countries, particularly China and India. And this is not unusual if you look back the history of the last, 2,000 years. As late as 1820, according to the calculation of Angus Madison, very famous economic historian, 29% of the world GDP was that of China, 16% of the world GDP was that of India. So as late as early 19th century, China and India together had almost half of the GDP. At that time, United States had only 5%. So we are only going back to the period which is before 19th century. So you don't have to deplore about that. I mean, it's...
Could I just make an
very different conditions today.
Could I just make an underlying agreement with that, in part answer to your earlier question, Thomas, and then we should open it up to the audience, because this is going to be a wonderful opportunity for them to be able to ask questions on these, at least on some of the topics that I've mentioned, very controversial. But I don't believe there's, to use your language, much hope within the Western core for all the reasons that I've etched out. The very fact that Western Europe was the archetypical hegemonic system, the one that was most reshaped in the American image, in part because centuries before, America had been shaped in European, especially British image, the Scottish Enlightenment image. But the real question about the core is not will there be a reformation within the current core, the core, not only under America, but earlier under Britain, and then on an earlier day, at the beginning of the modern era, the Dutch. No, the real issue, will there be a whole new core in a whole new region? And that raises the, again, very ominous literature from international relations, the so-called literature on the hegemonic transition and the road to war. And historically, each time that a hegemonic power, a status quo power, has been challenged by a revisionist power, such as I've identified Russia and especially China to be, there has been roughly 2/3 or more of the time, this has led to a great war between the status quo hegemonic power and the aspirant hegemonic power. And that, I think, is the real question. Can the hegemonic transition, can the core transition between the United States and China do something that has been very rare in world history? In the international politics literature, the normal analogy is drawn from a century ago. The America of that day was Britain. They were the status quo, liberal global power. Mm-hmm. They were confronted by a revisionist national corporatist power, Germany, a national mercantilist power, if you will. And that led, of course, not just to one horrible world war, but a second horrible world war, a 30 Years' War, coming after the more famous 30 Years' War in Germany before. And the great fear is that the relationships between the United States and China today are recapitulating the relationships between Britain and Germany a century or more ago. And therefore the great challenge is to get off the road to war. But that requires an elite in the status quo power to make prudent compromises. Unfortunately, the British elite made not so prudent compromises against Germany in the run-up to the Second World War. And that was immediately called appeasement, and ever since has made it impossible for the American elite to appease, to make concessions that can still preserve the vital interest of the status quo power while yielding on its peripheral interest to meet the vital interest of the aspirant power. So you're absolutely right that Eisuke, that you're absolutely right, that the real transition is from one core to a new core. The core of the last 200 years, or by counting the modern age that sort of commenced more or less in the West, the last 500 years to a whole new core, which of course, as you pointed out, is the very old core.
Okay. Questions? Perry?
This is to Kurth. You mentioned the irresistible force being an immovable object, okay, in both Europe, Russia, and Asia. But you haven't said anything about Latin America, which was the third axis of your system.
Yes. At first glance, the U.S. hegemonic system in Latin America that had already existed in prototypical form before 1947. It was then consolidated in 47 with the Rio Pact, a security treaty, and in 48 with the Organization of American States, an international organization. And these became the prototype for NATO. That particular hegemonic system more or less continued throughout the Cold War. I'll say a little bit about the less in a moment. More or less continued as a stable system, and more or less continued since the end of the Cold War as a stable system. Occasional disruptions, most dramatically when Cuba seceded from the system, violated the rules of the system and became an ally of a great European power, and that was the Soviet Union. But the United States then carefully and systematically isolated the Cuban Revolution to Cuba itself, So Cuba was a kind of little sore thumb sticking out of the system. At one point, it stuck in the eyes of the United States at the Cuban Missile Crisis and could have led to a truly world historical disaster. But after that, it was sort of isolated. Then there was a second threat when Nicaragua became a kind of Marxist revolutionary country, but that was also isolated. More recently, in other words, the system operated very smoothly from an American point of view, with isolating a few exceptions, and they had been successful by bringing overwhelming economic force, military and paramilitary force, political hegemony, ideology, neoliberalism, Washington Consensus, and all of that. But with the Chavez revolution in Venezuela commencing in 1999, that has now spread to several countries, hasn't been isolated, so to speak, threats to American hegemony in one country. It hasn't been isolated to that. So now you get Venezuela and allies in admittedly small countries, Nicaragua, Bolivia, Ecuador, but there is no effective U.S. response to this. And Venezuela, of course, has become a catastrophic disaster for all parties concerned. And the United States has not been able to do what in the past, step in one way or another and put it right, at least by the American dimension. So it's not creating a road to war, which could cause the American hegemonic systems in Europe, or especially in East Asia, to end with a bang. But it's sort of it's withering away, it's wearing out, it's disappearing with a whimper.
Tom?
Well, is there something wrong with my brain? I'd like to ask Mr. Sakakibara. It seems to me it was a very interesting discussion, but it slipped past a few things, notably the point that right now Japan is allied with the old core. Growing up next to you is the prospective big new core country, one belt, one road, expanding out of Asia. Now, particularly as I'm looking at the results of the Japanese election just in the last day or so, possibly you could explain to me the Japanese thinking about how do they transit from the old to the new core, or what exactly, or put it another way, Toyota's a worldwide company, and a large chunk of the world is falling into the hands of China. I'd just love to hear a bit about this.
Well, Japan in this respect is in a very interesting position. Of course, Japan is a U.S. ally, and in terms of the national security, Japan crucially depends upon the U.S. military force. However, as far as the economic relationship is concerned, the closest country to Japan is China. More than 30% of the Japanese export goes to China, including Hong Kong and Taiwan. And less than 15% of the Japanese export goes to the United States. So at least the Japanese economic sort of interest is concerned, China is the biggest ally of Japan. So Japan is in between the United States and China. And of course, there are frequent, some hiccups every now and then with the Chinese government because of the difference of the regime. But I think, thinking of the elites in Japan, including Mr. Abe, is that we should really play the role of mediating between the United States and China, and we should never be hostile and antagonistic to China, even if the regime are different. Did I answer your question? Pardon?
I mean, there is a fairly obvious contradiction between what Mr. Abe was pursuing with small islands out there and any policy of, if you like, being friendly with China.
You mean territorial dispute between China and Japan?
Among others.
Well, territorial dispute has always been there, and I don't think it is a major obstacle in foreign relations, between Japan and China. Mr. Abe, although he is very quite pro-American, he is not anti-China either. And Japanese population support Mr. Abe, as was sort of expressed in the recent election. It's a major victory for Mr. Abe. And Mr. Abe's diplomatic position, of mediating between China and the United States and trying to solve the problem of North Korea with the help of China, I think is supported by the general public.
I was wondering if we're beginning to see the beginning of the Russian takeover of Europe, and that we Europeans should be a bit concerned about our futures because we've got Brexit. Was that a Russian arrangement? Trump and his sort of skepticism about NATO and his running in the face of two packed European projects, Iran and climate change, for example. We're beginning to see, is this all part of Putin's plan? Are we right in the middle of that plan, being part of the Russian core rather than the American core over here?
Well, I think that is a good first approximation of the Russian conception, but I think it doesn't wholly fit some of the important nuances and subtleties. And the Russian conception, not unlike the Chinese conception, they're both historically great land powers, but impinging upon maritime regions. But the Russian conception isn't sort of either or. That was very clear, of course, under Stalin. But normally the Russian conception isn't either or, but kind of concentric circles or spectra of either in the Russian security zone, and at the opposite end, the Western power, whatever it of the day, security zone, and in between is a continua. And that was perfectly expressed even under Stalin, not on the central front, but the northern flank of NATO, where Finland was in the Russian security zone militarily, but was in the Western zone economically and culturally, and more politically than in the Russian zone. Sweden was formally a neutral, but its military, especially its navy and its submarines, operated all the time de facto with the United States, especially in the last decade of the Cold War. Armed neutrality. Norway and Denmark from the beginning were members of NATO, but never had U.S. troops there. At most, in the Reagan administration, the U.S. pre-positioned equipment there, so NATO troops could suddenly arrive and fall upon their gear, in the phrase of the day, in northern NATO. Iceland was wholly within the American alliance system. So notice on the northern flank there was a continuum. If even under the Soviets that was acceptable, that would be acceptable, I think, under post-Soviet, as a Russian Federation regime. Now, but that doesn't mean that is consistent with the vital interest of most of the European countries. But that means there should be negotiations. But unfortunately, the Russian opportunity is one big country negotiates, as he would like to have many small European countries negotiate. So the Europeans have a real challenge. As the United States' will and ability to defend Russia diminishes, then the Europeans have to find an alternative. But the European elites, both on the right center party and the left center party, have learned to think like Americans. So they're not going to negotiate. So their answer to your question lies in the hands of the European electorate. But if the European electorate has been so shall we say, fragmented, so distorted by the dual economies that the American-type system is recreated in Europe, the European electorate is not yet in a position to bring up a robust alternative that would be able to negotiate with strength and firmness and conviction. These words hardly characterize the European political leaders today, to maintain the vital interest of Europe while yielding on the peripheral interest. If you see what I mean.
We end up with Finland.
With what?
We all end up with
Yes, and my belief is you don't have to do that. But you could end up very much as some parts like Denmark and Norway during the Cold War, or even like Iceland, if those parts weren't too close to the Russians. But I don't think this requires a subtlety that the only living American today who understands this is Henry Kissinger, and he's 93 years old. And there are no Kissingers unto the next generation in Europe or America.
There's one question. Oh, three. So let's. Oh, didn't see that. So quick questions because we don't have so much time left, and we collect these. Four. You were first, I think.
Quick question. When do you think the Ukrainian crisis is going to be resolved?
When do I think the Ukrainian crisis will be resolved? I did not set you up to say this for the audience. Henry Kissinger literally wrote an article for the Washington Post in April 2014 with the title, "How the Ukrainian Crisis Will Be Resolved." So the very fact that he wrote an article answering your question then, of course, it makes it especially apropos. Well, essentially, his solution was to Finlandize Ukraine. Finlandize Ukraine, but that would allow you to continue to NATOize or Europeanize the Baltic countries by the tit-for-tat arrangement.
Okay, excellent short question.
Yeah, yes. We see like with policy in America, like climate change and the Paris Agreement, that companies like Amazon have stepped up and say we're going to stay in the Paris Climate Agreement. What happens to American nationalism if Amazon opens their second headquarters in Canada?
We were going to collect, otherwise we don't have time. Thanks.
Okay, I have some quick comments. One is, I think, a book whose title best captures the themes that you're describing is Alice Amsden's book, The Rise and the Rest, which is about the rise not just of East Asia, but
I quite agree. Yep.
emerging market economies. And she means the rise of the rest, not simply these economies are rising, but their alternative economic thinking and approaches to economic development. Since 2009, I've been teaching political economy modules which devote the main attention to non-Western economic thinking in Japan, China, Brazil, India, and a number of other countries. And some of these, particularly Japan, offers the most sophisticated alternatives to Western economic thinking, anticipating many of the themes of this conference. This conference is focused on alternatives within Western thinking. Japan and China, Brazil, Latin American structuralism have anticipated many of these themes and been practicing them for decades. And I think this is a kind of alternative perspective on not just the rise of the rest economically, but as alternative centres of economic thinking. And the papers we heard this morning suggested in many ways that actually Western economic theory, or large parts of it, have actually become dysfunctional. And this suggests that non-Western economic theories, which have been widely ignored by Western economists or dismissed as not terribly important or being really of local interest, are in some ways actually overtaking Western theory as a basis of successful economic policies.
Yeah.
My question is actually a follow-up of Ukrainian crisis question. How would Ukraine proceed with its geopolitical and especially military development in order to not cause a tit-for-tat reaction from Russia in the future?
Excellent. And last question.
Yeah, I wonder, will the ongoing conflict between India and China escalate to an open war?
Okay, I would say you were directly addressed to.
First, let me take this a very important question about economic theory and competing economic models and say I wholly agree with every jot and tittle that you said. And I believe that Xi Jinping wholly agrees with you too. And I suspect that in an earlier day, at least, the Japanese finance ministry and certainly Mitti agreed with you too. And I believe that I referred to the earlier analogy of the rise of Germany confronting the status quo Britain, and I mentioned national mercantilist or national corporatist. I believe Xi Jinping has a conception of national mercantilism with Chinese characteristics. And the core of that is infrastructure diplomacy, like the Belt and Road Initiative and the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. Yeah. And this is a whole alternative model. They are developing alternative theories of international politics, and they are developing alternative theories of international economics. They recapitulate the ancient Chinese imperial tradition of tributary states, updated to not just to the information age, the industrial age, but the information age. And I think this is going to be a great competitor to a Western way of thinking, just like the German historical school and the German national protectionist was a great threat to the British way of thinking in the late 19th and early 20th century. So I'm agreeing with the extreme importance. There will be a hegemonic transition in the realm of economic theory like there is one in the realm of world politics.
Can I just add that I'm writing a global history of economic thinking from the 18th century to the present, which has the subtitle Decentering Western Economics.
Beautifully done.
The decentering process is what we're witnessing.
Good.
Shortly, because we're running out of time.
My interpretation of what he has said is that we are probably moving from the regime of market capitalism to what could be called the state capitalism. Particularly, the Chinese-style state capitalism. They do believe in some kind of markets mechanism, but at the same time, role of the state is much more important than the role of the state in the United States and UK. And this state capitalism, to some extent, is adhered by the Japanese government as well. So this is a different regime, but how it would evolve in the coming years is something we need to observe very carefully.
Short answer on the other short questions?
Yes, briefly on the Ukrainian question. Well, insofar, now, a Ukrainian military will only have meaning if, as a military, i.e. one that fights foreign armies, if it were integrated with NATO. It would have no other meaning. And if it were integrated NATO, it therefore becomes a threat to the Russians. So therefore, the Ukrainian military can only have meaning if it is essentially what we would call in America a National Guard. That is to say, it is a local force that deals with domestic disturbances rather than with foreign threats. Now, the Ukrainians in Kiev and a fortiori in Lvov do not want that. But that's the necessary condition for Ukraine to be restored to some version of territorial integrity and not have little statelets split off that then become running sores probing into the rest of Ukraine. That's regrettable, but that's what it means to be, dare I say, the little Russians next to the great Russians.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the questions and to the panel. I'd just say one last idea, because I'm the German on this. I understand the idea, but I hope that America will not never get near to the situation where Germany was for the 0 hour, for the Stunde Null. So we should try to manage this shifting in course, and that's perhaps something which INET has excellently done with this conference in many respects, to renew thinking, to avoid that this crash will be too bad for the US and for the countries around. So in that sense, I still did not lose the rest of my hope. Thank you.